and I'm grateful for the opportunity to speak in today's debate and to talk about this very important subject. I would like, however, to start with a moment's reflection. Mr. Bone, we are all here today lucky to live in the developed world, and indeed in the United Kingdom in particular. So many people around the world face such enormous challenges, and it is important to remember that many of these challenges are actually getting worse at this current time, as far too many people struggle with the effects of the climate emergency, war and natural disasters. It is our responsibility in the developed world to help those who have not had the same opportunities that we've all had. Indeed, this is a duty for all of us, and it's a duty which has been thrown into sharp relief by the recent tragic events in Turkey and Syria. And I do want to turn first to the earthquake before addressing the longer-term issues around development. Mr. Bone, it has been simply heartbreaking to watch the horrific images of the earthquake in Turkey and northern Syria. This recent quake was the worst for nearly 100 years and measured 7.8 on the Richter scale. It was, quite simply, an incredibly powerful natural disaster, and sadly, the effects seem to be made worse by what can only be described as apparent shoddy building practices and lax regulation. I would, however, like to pay tribute to all of those taking part in the response to this dreadful, dreadful disaster. That's both those helping in Turkey and Syria and, indeed, across the whole world. The DEC in Britain, local branches of charities, local communities, and, indeed, local residents who've taken part in collections. They are all doing their bit in helping those in need at this most awful time. Mr. Bone, it falls to us to help, both in an emergency like the earthquake or indeed the recent floods in Pakistan, but also over the much longer term. And I'm absolutely sure that everyone in the United Kingdom shares these concerns and this commitment to help. So I would like to turn now to the wider issues of development, which are indeed the subject of today's debate. Mr. Bone, there is no doubt that the world is changing, but while many countries are developing, there is still enormous economic and social inequality across the world, and it is truly sobering to consider the scale of this enormous problem. Even today, nearly 1 in 10 of the world's population lives in extreme poverty, and that is despite considerable steps forward in the last 40 or 50 years. That poverty is found in many countries, and in particular, it blights the lives of people living in rural areas, and indeed many of those who've migrated to enormous cities, which are emerging around the world. There remains extreme inequality in health and education, which is something I want to return to later. Mr. Bone, I also would like to make some broader points, and indeed to recap on the recent direction of UK government policy. Turning to recent history, the last Labour government made real steps forward, bringing in the 0.7% target for aid, so that the proportion of GDP spent on aid matched the amount recommended by the UN, indeed picking up on work which dated back or went as far back as the 1980s with the Brundtland Commission. It is truly important that Britain led on this policy, and there were very real results. 1.5 million more people received improved sanitation and water services, and we in this country helped 40 million children go to school. I would also like to acknowledge the very important work that the Conservative government, the Cameron government, did as they continued this policy. Sadly, Mr. Bone, the 0.7% target was scrapped by more recent Conservative governments, and this has left the UK presiding over a declining aid budget. Worse still, there have been attempts to rebadge other spending as aid, and this includes the deeply mistaken plan to spend £3 billion from the development budget on the cost of housing refugees. This mistaken approach has knocked down the pillars on which UK's international leadership was built, and it has damaged Britain's credibility around the world. Added to that, a botched merger of DFID and the FCO has undermined delivery. Development spending, I should say, is not only a force for moral good, as I mentioned earlier, it is also sensible policy. It's also worth remembering that while aid from the developed world is helpful, it's important, it is not the only answer, but it still can be a significant force for good. And British aid has played a very important part in helping those in need around the world. Our contribution has declined, our influence is in retreat, and our ability to be a force for good is in retreat. I will certainly give way to the honourable gentleman.
I commend the Honourable Gentleman for bringing this forward. He always brings very important subjects to Westminster Hall, but also to the Chamber as well. Does the Honourable Gentleman recognise, while government has a role to play, there are many NGOs and charities, and I can think of many in my constituency who are church groups who come together and make significant and important contributions to health, to education, to job opportunity, to ensuring that young girls have the opportunity equally to young boys. I mean, these also have to be recognised, because I feel that in my constituency, Mr. Chairman, I can speak for the Elim Church Missions as one example. What they do in Zimbabwe and in Malawi and in Swaziland is something that we cannot ignore. So they make a contribution alongside what government does as well. Can't be forgotten about.
Thank you, Mr. Bone. And I would like to commend the Honourable Gentleman for his words. And of course, the work of community and voluntary groups, of church groups, of other faith groups is so important and makes an enormous contribution and plays in many ways a leading role in aid around the world. As I was saying, I'm afraid our influence is in retreat, as is our ability to be a force for good. And the sad reality should be, and I hope will be, that this is a cause for reflection, and I hope for a much-needed reassessment by the Minister and his colleagues. I certainly will.
Later, but I was really struck in a conversation I had with someone working in one of our embassies who remarked that, from their perspective, the D in FCDO is currently silent, and was worried about their ability to do other things in that country as a result. Is this similar to experiences that he's had in conversation with others in this space?
Thank you, Mr. Bone, and I thank the Honourable Member for her point. I think she's making an excellent point, and there is a real risk here that the development work of the government gets somehow downplayed due to the reorganisation. And as I said earlier, there are also issues about delivery and the capacity within the new merged department. Mr. Bone, I would like to spell out what this retreat means in real terms on the ground and for the very poorest. We know now that bilateral aid on education fell from £789 million in 2019 to just £545 million in 2020. That's nearly a third, a reduction nearly a third. And final spending in 2021 was just £457 million. This falls way short. The UK's £430 million pledge for the Global Education Partnership for 2021 to 25 was an increase on previous commitments, but is lower than many had expected. Further, analysis by charities indicates that education programmes were cut by 30% in the first round of cuts in 2020. These are severe cuts. Many local and international NGOs have spoken about the impact of cuts on children's education and indeed on health. So, for example, the Dhaka Asania mission, after seeing 100% of their funding cut, said that 1,250 out-of-school children living in flood-prone areas in northern Bangladesh will not have access to quality non-formal primary education. They said that within weeks of the announcement, our project would have enrolled 700 out-of-school girls and 560 out-of-school boys into rural-based non-formal primary education centres, and all this has been cut. In another case, an NGO which preferred to remain anonymous saw a 100% cut to funding for a programme that protected the rights of children and enabled them to grow up healthily. The project improved access to inclusive quality education for 1,700 children marginalised by ethnicity, gender and/or disability in 3 rural villages in Laos. Again, in terms of health, in 2022, the UK pledged £1 billion to the Global Fund to fight AIDS, tuberculosis, malaria. That's £400 million less than in 2019. And I should remind colleagues that every minute of the day, a child dies of malaria. Hundreds, around 600, are estimated to die every day from TB. So, Mr. Bone, I hope I've set out what the current policy means to those who are most in need of help. I want to turn now to some of the principles which I believe should guide our wider strategy, at a point which, as I said earlier, I do hope the government is able to carry out a rethink of its recent approach. Because it is clear that current policy is simply not working and that ministers should be starting again. And they should be thinking again about how the world's changed, yet at the same time building on what we know has worked in the recent past. We need to take a sensible and strategic approach to this important issue. And first of all, in my view, the UK should lead by example, not breaking our word or our commitments. And that means not reducing our development spending or asking others to do more in our place. It also means not preaching about net zero without a credible plan to get there. Secondly, our strategy should mean rediscovering our core principles, which should always guide us, our commitment to human rights, to democracy, and to the rule of law. Thirdly, our approach to development needs to reflect the world we live in, a world which, as I said, is quite clearly changing. We should focus on where we really can make a difference, and our approach should be grounded in both an understanding of the wider world and how aid can be delivered in partnership with local communities and developing countries. Mr. Bone, there is so much that I could say about innovative work in partnership in local communities, community-level initiatives. However, time is pressing, and I do want to sum up because I appreciate many other colleagues would like to contribute to today's debate. As I said earlier, those in need around the world we are responsible for supporting those in need around the world. And this is about both responding in an emergency, and I would like to again thank those who supported the people in Turkey and Syria in the recent earthquakes. However, there's a much longer-term need, which we need to acknowledge and address properly. Sadly, the current government, I'm afraid, is failing, and the cuts have set back vital work around the world. This is having a very real effect on communities and indeed the most vulnerable. And the failure to continue with the 0.7% target is harming the education, health and economic opportunities of the very people who need our support most. We do need to get Britain back on track to meet its commitment to the UN's 0.7% target as soon as possible as the financial situation allows. Mr. Bone, what is needed now is a reassessment of the situation and a new strategy, and I look forward to the Minister's response during this debate.